The final explosive device was discovered in the most unexpected location, beneath the palace's oldest foundation stones, in a chamber that dated back to the original royal residence built on the site centuries earlier. Morrison had remembered this space from historical briefings about the building's architecture, knowledge that proved crucial when conventional searches failed to locate the last timer-activated charge. Morrison descended into the ancient chamber accompanied by the explosive ordnance disposal team's most experienced specialist, Staff Sergeant Williams. The cramped space contained stone walls that had witnessed centuries of British royal history, now threatened by modern terrorism that sought to erase that heritage forever. The irony was not lost on Morrison as he crawled through passages that kings and queens had once used to escape various threats throughout history. The device was more sophisticated than the others, positioned to cause maximum structural damage to the palace's historical foundation. Its detonation would not only destroy the building above, but potentially damage neighboring structures and create casualties among the civilians who lived and worked in the surrounding area. The terrorists had planned their final blow to cause maximum symbolic and practical destruction. Staff Sergeant Williams worked with steady hands despite the pressure, his years of experience with explosive devices evident in every movement. Morrison provided security and assistance, using his knowledge of the ancient chamber's layout to position equipment and maintain communication with the command center above. The timer showed less than 30 minutes remaining before automatic detonation. The disposal process was complicated by the device's sophisticated anti-tampering mechanisms, designed to prevent exactly the kind of intervention that Williams was attempting. The terrorists had anticipated that their charges might be discovered, and they had incorporated features intended to ensure destruction even if security forces located the devices. Morrison watched the timer count down while Williams worked methodically through multiple layers of protection. Outside the palace, London was beginning to wake up to what appeared to be a normal day. Citizens heading to work had no idea that one of their nation's most important symbols had spent the night under siege, or that the outcome of a desperate battle was still being determined in chambers beneath their feet. Morrison thought about the thousands of people who would walk past the palace gates later that morning, oblivious to how close they had come to witnessing a national tragedy. Detective Inspector Chin's voice in Morrison's earpiece provided updates from the broader investigation that was unfolding across London. The terrorist network had been extensively infiltrated using the communication equipment captured earlier, and arrests were being made throughout the city. The operation had revealed connections to international terrorist organizations and potentially hostile foreign governments, suggesting that the attack on Buckingham Palace was part of a larger campaign against British institutions. Williams announced that he had successfully bypassed the device's primary anti-tampering mechanisms, but the final disarming sequence would require precise timing to prevent automatic detonation. Morrison found himself holding specialized tools while Williams worked with components that could kill them both if handled incorrectly. The irony of a Coldstream guard assisting with bomb disposal in the basement of Buckingham Palace was not lost on him, but his training had prepared him to adapt to whatever circumstances demanded. The timer reached 10 minutes as Williams began the final disarming sequence. Morrison's radio crackled with reports that all other explosive devices had been successfully neutralized, making this chamber the last battleground in a fight that had lasted throughout the night. The weight of responsibility was enormous. Failure here would still result in catastrophic damage despite all the previous successes. Morrison's thoughts turned briefly to his wife Sarah and daughter Emma, safely asleep in their flat near Wellington Barracks. They would wake up to news reports about a terrorist incident at Buckingham Palace, but they would not know about Morrison's role until much later. The secrecy surrounding counter-terrorism operations meant that his family would experience hours of worry before learning that he had survived and played a crucial part in protecting Britain's most important royal residence. William's hands moved with surgical precision as he worked through the final steps of the disarming process. Morrison could see sweat beading on the specialist's forehead despite the cool temperature in the ancient chamber, a sign of the enormous pressure under which they were both operating. The timer showed 5 minutes remaining when Williams encountered an unexpected complication that required additional time to resolve safely. The device incorporated a backup detonation system that Williams had not seen in previous terrorist operations, suggesting that the hostile organization had access to advanced technological capabilities. Morrison helped position additional equipment as Williams worked to understand and neutralize this final threat, aware that they were dealing with people who had planned extensively for exactly this kind of intervention. The breakthrough came when Williams realized that the backup system could be defeated using the same techniques that had worked on the primary mechanisms, but in reverse order. Morrison watched the timer reach 2 minutes as Williams began what he assured Morrison would be the final disarming sequence. The ancient chamber seemed to hold its breath as centuries of British history waited to learn whether it would survive into the future. Williams completed the disarming sequence with 43 seconds remaining on the timer. The device powered down with a soft electronic tone that seemed impossibly quiet given the magnitude of what had just been prevented. Morrison felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by the realization of what they had accomplished together in the depths of Buckingham Palace. The command center erupted in controlled celebration as Williams reported successful neutralization of the final device. Morrison began the climb back to the surface, emerging into the familiar corridors of the palace as dawn light streamed through windows he had watched from his ceremonial post just 24 hours earlier. The transformation from ceremonial duty to active combat operations felt surreal, but his training had prepared him to adapt to whatever circumstances demanded. Captain Reynolds met Morrison as he emerged from the basement levels, offering congratulations that carried the weight of understanding what had been at stake. The Coldstream Guards had proven once again that their ceremonial role masked genuine military capabilities, and that the traditions they represented could adapt to meet modern threats. Morrison's knowledge of the palace had been instrumental in preventing a catastrophe that could have changed British history. The aftermath of the operation would involve extensive debriefings, analysis of the terrorist network's capabilities, and security reviews designed to prevent similar threats in the future. Morrison knew that his role in the events would remain classified, but he also understood that he had participated in one of the most significant counterterrorism operations in British history. The ancient traditions of the Coldstream Guards had proven their continuing relevance in defending the monarchy against contemporary enemies. 3 weeks later, Morrison returned to his ceremonial duties at the palace gates, standing motionless in his red tunic and bearskin hat while tourists took photographs and children waved. The public would never know about the night when he had crawled through ancient chambers beneath their feet, disarming explosive devices and engaging terrorist operatives in the corridors of British history. To the outside world, he remained simply a ceremonial guard, representing traditions that seemed disconnected from modern realities. But Morrison now understood the true significance of his role in ways that went far beyond ceremony and pageantry. The Coldstream Guards stood not just as symbols of British military tradition, but as active protectors of the values and institutions that defined the nation's identity. His knowledge of the palace had saved centuries of British heritage, and his willingness to adapt ceremonial duties to combat operations had proven that ancient traditions could meet modern challenges. As he stood at his post, watching familiar crowds of tourists gather outside the palace gates, Morrison reflected on how his moment of decision had changed everything. The terrorist plot had been defeated not just by advanced technology and international cooperation, but by a soldier who understood that protecting tradition sometimes required transforming it. The Coldstream Guards would continue their ceremonial duties, but they would also remain ready to defend the monarchy against any threat that might emerge in an uncertain world. The red tunic and bearskin hat that tourists photographed represented more than historical pageantry. They symbolized the continuing commitment of Britain's military forces to adapt their capabilities to meet whatever challenges might threaten the institutions and values they had sworn to protect. Morrison's moment had demonstrated that the most effective guardians of tradition were those who understood when tradition itself needed to evolve to survive. The main assault began at exactly 2:37 in the morning, announced not by alarms or sirens, but by the subtle change in radio chatter that Morrison had learned to recognize as the prelude to combat. 3 separate teams of armed terrorists were moving against the palace perimeter, each approaching from directions calculated to divide the defensive response, and create maximum confusion. Morrison had positioned himself in the Queen's Gallery, a location that provided visual command of multiple approach routes while remaining hidden from external observation. His night vision equipment showed the advancing terrorist teams as they moved through the palace grounds, their movements coordinated by the communication systems that counterterrorism specialists were now monitoring in real time. The lead assault team consisted of 6 individuals, armed with automatic weapons and wearing body armor that suggested military training. They moved with the precision of professional soldiers, using hand signals and maintaining tactical spacing as they approached the building's main entrance. Morrison recognized immediately that these were not ordinary terrorists, but trained operatives with experience in similar operations. Detective Inspector Chen's voice in his earpiece confirmed what Morrison was observing. The terrorist operatives showed signs of military training, possibly special forces backgrounds, and they were equipped with weapons and equipment that suggested state-level support. This was not just a terrorist attack, but potentially an act of warfare disguised as domestic extremism. Morrison's role in the defense required him to coordinate between the visible Coldstream guards maintaining perimeter security and the hidden counterterrorism specialists positioned throughout the building. His knowledge of palace protocols and defensive positions made him an essential link between different elements of the security response, but it also made him a target for terrorist operatives seeking to disrupt communications. The first exchange of gunfire erupted near the East Wing, where one of the terrorist teams encountered a patrol of armed police officers. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the palace corridors, immediately triggering emergency protocols that sealed certain sections of the building and activated additional security measures. Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with actual combat, but his training kept him focused on his tactical objectives. The terrorist command structure immediately adapted to the contact with security forces, redirecting their other teams toward alternative entry points that intelligence had suggested were less heavily defended. Morrison watched through surveillance monitors as the hostile operatives demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the palace's vulnerabilities, exploiting exactly the weaknesses that security assessments had identified as potential concerns. Morrison's position in the Queen's Gallery provided him with visual observation of the terrorists' main assault route, but it also exposed him to return fire once his location was discovered. The gallery's windows and architectural features offered both advantages and vulnerabilities, requiring careful positioning to maintain effectiveness while minimizing exposure to hostile fire. The breakthrough came when Morrison identified a pattern in the terrorist communications that revealed their intended target. Rather than seeking to capture or harm members of the royal family, the operation was designed to plant explosive devices in specific locations throughout the palace. The terrorists were attempting to destroy the building itself, along with its irreplaceable historical artifacts and symbolic significance to the British nation. This revelation changed everything about the defensive response. Rather than protecting people who had already been evacuated to secure locations, the operation was now focused on preserving one of Britain's most important cultural and historical sites. The stakes involved not just immediate casualties, but the destruction of centuries of British heritage and the psychological impact on the nation's morale. Morrison's earpiece crackled with updates from other sections of the palace, where his fellow Coldstream guards were engaging terrorist operatives in running battles through corridors that had witnessed centuries of British history. The contrast between the building's peaceful grandeur and the current violence was jarring, but Morrison forced himself to focus on tactical necessities rather than historical significance. The terrorist teams demonstrated remarkable coordination despite the resistance they encountered. As one team was engaged by security forces in the East Wing, another used the distraction to penetrate the building's lower levels through service entrances that Morrison had helped identify during the earlier reconnaissance phases. The multi-axis approach was overwhelming the palace's defensive capabilities. Morrison found himself in direct combat when a terrorist operative appeared in the Queen's Gallery, apparently seeking to plant explosive devices near priceless artworks that represented centuries of British cultural achievement. The confrontation took place among paintings and sculptures worth millions of pounds, with Morrison acutely aware that stray bullets could destroy irreplaceable treasures. The engagement was brief, but intense. Morrison's training with the Coldstream guards had prepared him for exactly this kind of close-quarters combat, and his familiarity with the gallery's layout provided crucial tactical advantages. The terrorist was skilled and determined, but Morrison's defensive position and knowledge of the terrain allowed him to neutralize the threat without damaging the surrounding artworks. The captured operative yielded critical intelligence about the explosive devices being planted throughout the building. The charges were sophisticated, designed not just to cause structural damage but to create fires that would spread rapidly through the palace's historical sections. The terrorists intended to ensure that even if they were defeated, the symbolic heart of the British monarchy would be destroyed. Morrison's radio exploded with urgent communications as counterterrorism specialists began a desperate search for explosive devices throughout the palace. His knowledge of the building's hidden passages and forgotten storage areas made him essential to the search operation, but time was running critically short. The captured terrorist had revealed that the devices were on timers set to detonate at dawn, regardless of whether the assault teams achieved their other objectives. The search operation required Morrison to guide explosive ordnance disposal specialists through sections of the palace that few people had ever seen. Hidden chambers and forgotten passages built during previous centuries now became crucial to preventing a catastrophe that would devastate British culture and history. Morrison's years of ceremonial duties had familiarized him with these areas through routine security checks that now proved essential for national security. The first explosive device was discovered in the throne room, hidden behind historic tapestries that dated back to the 18th century. The bomb was sophisticated, designed to cause maximum structural damage to the building's ceremonial heart while creating a fire that would spread to adjacent areas. Disposing of it required delicate work by specialists while Morrison provided security against terrorist operatives who might attempt to interfere. Additional devices were found throughout the building, each positioned to maximize both structural damage and symbolic impact. The terrorists had studied the palace's layout extensively, identifying locations where explosions would destroy not just the building, but specific artifacts and rooms that held special significance for the British monarchy and national identity. Morrison's role evolved from combat operations to coordination of the most complex explosive ordnance disposal operation in British history. His knowledge of the palace's construction and layout allowed him to guide specialists to potential device locations while maintaining security against terrorist operatives who remained active throughout the building. The success of the entire operation now depended on his ability to think like both a soldier and a historian. As dawn approached, the explosive ordnance disposal teams had located and disarmed most of the devices, but intelligence suggested that additional charges might remain hidden in areas that had not yet been searched. Morrison faced a desperate race against time to identify every potential location before the timer-activated devices could destroy one of Britain's most important cultural and historical treasures. The terrorist assault had been largely defeated, but the real threat now came from explosive devices that could detonate automatically regardless of what happened to their operators. Morrison's knowledge of the palace would determine whether centuries of British history survived the next few hours, and whether the symbolic heart of the monarchy would continue to exist for future generations. His years of standing guard at the palace had prepared him for this moment in ways he had never imagined. The ceremonial duties that tourists photographed every day had developed the knowledge and skills that now stood between Britain and the loss of its most important royal residence. The final phase of the operation would test everything he had learned about duty, sacrifice, and the protection of traditions that defined his nation's identity. Morrison moved through the palace's service levels like a ghost, his movements guided by intelligence updates that painted an increasingly complex picture of the terrorist operation. The captured operative had provided crucial information under interrogation, revealing that the main assault was scheduled to begin in phases, with the first wave targeting the palace's communication systems to isolate the building from outside assistance. The counterterrorism team had identified 6 hostile operatives already inside the palace, with an unknown number positioned around the perimeter. Morrison's assignment focused on the most dangerous infiltrator, a demolitions expert who was moving toward the building's main electrical systems. Disabling the palace's power would create chaos and eliminate many of the electronic security measures protecting the royal family. Detective Inspector Chin's voice crackled through Morrison's earpiece, providing real-time updates from the command center. Surveillance systems throughout London had identified the terrorist support network, revealing an operation far more extensive than initially believed. Vehicle checkpoints were being established around the palace, but the immediate threat came from the operatives already inside the building. Morrison's route took him through areas of the palace that existed in complete darkness, illuminated only by the infrared capabilities of his night vision equipment. The mechanical rooms and utility corridors that housed the building's infrastructure were perfect hiding places for someone intent on sabotage. Years of emergency drills had familiarized Morrison with these areas, but tonight he was hunting trained killers rather than participating in exercises. The demolitions expert was identified through thermal imaging as he approached the main electrical distribution center. Morrison could see the individual's heat signature moving methodically through the basement levels, carrying equipment that appeared to include both explosive charges and electronic devices. The terrorists' movements suggested familiarity with the building's layout, confirming fears about inside information. Morrison's tactical position allowed him to observe the target without being detected, but the narrow corridors and limited escape routes made any confrontation extremely dangerous. The demolitions expert was clearly experienced, checking for surveillance devices and maintaining constant awareness of potential threats. A direct assault would likely result in the detonation of explosive charges, potentially causing massive damage to the palace's infrastructure. The solution required combining Morrison's intimate knowledge of the palace with advanced tactical equipment provided by the counter-terrorism unit. A specialized gas delivery system would allow him to incapacitate the target without triggering explosive devices, but the timing would be critical. Any mistake could alert other terrorist operatives or result in the very sabotage they were trying to prevent. Morrison positioned himself in a ventilation shaft above the electrical distribution center, watching as the demolitions expert began placing charges on critical power systems. The terrorist worked with professional efficiency, suggesting extensive training in military or industrial demolitions. Each explosive device was precisely positioned to maximize damage while minimizing the risk of premature detonation. The command center confirmed that similar operations were underway throughout the building. Other Coldstream guards were engaging terrorist operatives in different sections of the palace, while counterterrorism specialists worked to identify and neutralize the external support network. The coordination required to defeat the plot was testing every aspect of Britain's security infrastructure. Morrison's earpiece delivered the authorization to engage, but with strict parameters designed to maintain operational security. The demolitions expert had to be neutralized before completing the sabotage, but without creating noise or disturbance that might alert Confederates. The gas delivery system would provide a silent solution, but Morrison would have only seconds to secure the area before the unconscious terrorist was discovered missing by his team. The deployment went exactly as planned. Morrison dropped silently from the ventilation shaft as the specialized gas began filling the electrical room. The demolitions expert had no warning before losing consciousness, collapsing beside the partially armed explosive devices. Morrison immediately began the delicate process of disarming the charges while calling for explosive ordnance disposal specialists. The captured terrorist yielded crucial intelligence about the operation's timeline and objectives. The plot involved three distinct phases: infrastructure sabotage to create vulnerability, diversionary attacks to draw security forces away from the palace, and a final assault designed to penetrate the building's defenses during the resulting chaos. Morrison had just prevented the first phase, but the other elements remained active. Intelligence updates revealed that diversionary attacks were already beginning across London. Small explosive devices had detonated near government buildings, creating the impression of a coordinated assault on British institutions. Police and military resources were being deployed to respond to these incidents, exactly as the terrorists had planned. The palace's security forces were now operating with reduced external support. Morrison's next assignment took him to the palace's upper levels, where intelligence suggested another operative was targeting the communication systems that coordinated security throughout the royal residences. The individual had been tracked to the vicinity of the main server rooms, which housed the electronic infrastructure supporting everything from surveillance systems to emergency communications. The approach to the server rooms required crossing sections of the palace that remained in normal operation, maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual was happening. Morrison's maintenance worker disguise allowed him to move through public areas without attracting attention, but he was acutely aware that terrorist operatives might be observing these same areas. His target was identified as a woman in her 30s, posing as a member of the palace's IT support staff. Surveillance footage showed her accessing restricted areas using credentials that appeared legitimate, suggesting either forged identification or compromise of an actual staff member. Her movements indicated familiarity with the building's electronic infrastructure and security protocols. Morrison found her in the main server room, connecting sophisticated equipment to the palace's communication networks. The devices she was installing appeared designed to intercept and redirect electronic communications, potentially allowing the terrorist operation to monitor security responses in real time. The implications were staggering. The terrorist group could potentially hear every radio communication between palace security forces. The confrontation required immediate action to prevent completion of the electronic infiltration, but the server room's confined space and sensitive equipment created unique challenges. Any damage to the communication systems could handicap the counterterrorism operation, while allowing the infiltration to continue would provide the terrorist network with unprecedented intelligence capabilities. Morrison's approach combined stealth with psychological warfare, using his knowledge of the woman's likely training to create uncertainty about the security situation. Rather than immediately revealing himself, he began manipulating the server room's environmental controls, creating subtle changes in lighting and ventilation that would suggest potential discovery without confirming the presence of security forces. The psychological pressure worked exactly as intended. The operative began rushing her installation process, making mistakes that created opportunities for intervention. Morrison timed his approach to coincide with a moment when she was physically connected to the server equipment, making it impossible for her to immediately flee or destroy evidence. The capture yielded the most significant intelligence breakthrough of the operation. The woman carried encrypted communication devices that provided real-time access to the terrorist network's command structure. Counterterrorism specialists immediately began using this access to track other operatives and potentially feed disinformation to the hostile command center. Morrison learned that his actions had prevented two crucial elements of the terrorist plot, but the main assault remained imminent. The external diversionary attacks had achieved their purpose of drawing police resources away from the palace, and the assault teams were preparing to begin their infiltration. The next phase of the operation would test whether the remaining palace defenses could withstand a coordinated attack by trained professionals. The captured communications revealed that the terrorist operation included backup plans for dealing with discovery of their infiltrators. Rather than abandoning the mission, the command structure was accelerating the timeline and deploying additional resources. Morrison's successful interventions had actually triggered a more desperate and potentially more dangerous assault. As he prepared to move to his next assignment, Morrison reflected on how drastically his role had evolved since standing guard that morning. The ceremonial duties of the Coldstream Guards had given way to active combat operations that would determine the fate of the British monarchy. The ancient traditions he represented were proving their relevance against modern threats in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. The command center confirmed that the main assault was beginning, with armed teams approaching the palace from multiple directions. Morrison's knowledge of the building and his successful neutralization of internal threats would now be crucial in coordinating the defense against the most dangerous phase of the operation. The emergency briefing took place in the underground command center beneath Buckingham Palace, a facility that most tourists would never imagine existed. Morrison found himself surrounded by representatives from MI5, the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Unit, and senior officers from his own regiment. The room buzzed with urgent conversations as intelligence updates flowed in from across London. Detective Inspector Sarah Chun from Scotland Yard's So-15 Counterterrorism Command stood at the head of the briefing table, her laptop connected to multiple screens showing surveillance footage, maps, and threat assessments. Morrison had worked with police units before during state occasions, but never in circumstances like these. The gravity of the situation was evident in every face around the table. The terrorist group, identified as a splinter cell of international extremists, had been planning their attack for months. They had studied royal protocols, identified security weaknesses, and developed a sophisticated plan that involved multiple phases. The initial threat against Princess Catherine had been a diversionary tactic designed to draw security resources away from their real target, a state reception scheduled for the following evening. Morrison learned that the group had somehow obtained detailed blueprints of the palace, information about security rotations, and even the personal schedules of key royal family members. The level of inside knowledge they possessed suggested either a security breach or the involvement of someone with legitimate access to classified information. This revelation sent chills through everyone in the briefing room. The attack plan involved infiltrating the state reception, which would host heads of state from 12 Commonwealth nations. The potential casualties weren't limited to the royal family, but included world leaders whose deaths could trigger international conflicts. Morrison began to understand why every security agency in Britain was involved in the response. Intelligence indicated that the terrorists had positioned operatives in various locations around London, each with specific roles in the coordinated attack. Some were tasked with creating diversions to draw police and military resources away from the palace. Others were preparing to breach the building's security systems at precisely timed intervals. The main assault team was already in position, waiting for the signal to begin their operation. Captain Reynolds briefed Morrison and 3 other selected Coldstream guards on their specific mission. While the majority of the regiment would maintain visible security around the palace grounds, the 4 chosen soldiers would work undercover with counterterrorism specialists to identify and neutralize the immediate threats. Their intimate knowledge of palace protocols and building layouts made them invaluable assets in the operation. Morrison's assignment took him beyond anything he had ever imagined when he joined the Coldstream Guards. He would pose as a palace maintenance worker, using service corridors and hidden passages to reach positions where armed terrorists might attempt to infiltrate. His red uniform was replaced with coveralls and a tool belt, but beneath the disguise, he carried advanced communications equipment and weapons that few people knew the ceremonial guards were trained to use. The first phase of the operation began at 10 o'clock that evening. Morrison made his way through service tunnels beneath the palace, guided by blueprints that showed every hidden passage and emergency route built into the building over centuries. These passages had once hidden royal family members during World War II air raids, and now they would hide soldiers protecting the monarchy from a different kind of warfare. His earpiece crackled with updates from surveillance teams positioned throughout London. The terrorist operatives were beginning to move, coordinating their positions for what intelligence suggested would be a midnight assault. Morrison's heart rate remained steady despite the danger, his years of training allowing him to maintain focus even as the stakes continued to escalate. The palace above him continued its normal evening routine, with staff preparing for the next day's state reception, unaware of the drama unfolding in the shadows. Members of the royal family had been discreetly moved to secure locations, but their absence needed to appear routine to avoid alerting the terrorists that their plans had been discovered. Morrison's route took him through sections of the palace that few people ever saw. Behind the grand staterooms and public galleries lay a maze of service corridors, storage areas, and mechanical rooms that kept the massive building functioning. His familiarity with these areas, gained through years of duty rotations and security drills, now provided crucial tactical advantages. The first contact with hostile forces came at 11:15. Morrison was positioned in a service corridor near the grand staircase when his motion sensors detected unauthorized movement in an adjacent passage. The individual was moving with purpose toward the main reception areas, carrying equipment that surveillance suggested might be explosive devices. Morrison's training took over as he moved silently through the darkened corridor. His years of standing motionless for hours had taught him how to control his breathing, how to move without making sound, and how to maintain absolute focus under pressure. These skills, originally developed for ceremonial duties, now proved essential for counterterrorism operations. The terrorist operative was young, probably in his early 20s, dressed as a member of the palace cleaning crew. Morrison watched from concealment as the individual placed a small device behind a decorative panel near the state dining room. The device appeared to be some kind of monitoring equipment, possibly designed to provide intelligence for the main assault team. Morrison's communication with the command center had to be conducted in complete silence, using hand signals that were transmitted through a small camera attached to his equipment. The terrorist was armed and clearly trained in surveillance techniques, making any direct confrontation extremely dangerous. The priority was gathering intelligence about the broader plot while avoiding premature exposure of the counterterrorism operation. As Morrison continued his observation, he realized that the operative was not working alone. Subtle hand signals indicated communication with at least two other individuals positioned elsewhere in the building. The coordination between team members suggested military training and experience with similar operations. These were not amateur terrorists, but professional operatives with sophisticated planning capabilities. The revelation that multiple terrorists had already infiltrated the palace changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Morrison's role shifted from reconnaissance to active interdiction as the command center realized that waiting for the midnight assault might be too late. The devices being planted throughout the building could provide real-time intelligence to the assault team, or, worse, could be explosive charges designed to create chaos during the attack. Morrison received authorization to begin neutralizing the immediate threats, but with strict instructions to maintain operational security. Any alert to one terrorist cell could trigger premature activation of the entire plot, potentially creating the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. The next few hours would require surgical precision in eliminating threats without revealing the broader counterterrorism operation. His first target was the operative near the state dining room, who was now moving toward what appeared to be another device placement location. Morrison used his knowledge of palace acoustics and layout to position himself for an interception that would appear accidental to any observers. The young terrorist had no idea that the maintenance worker approaching from the adjacent corridor was actually one of Britain's most elite soldiers. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Morrison's hand-to-hand combat training, combined with the element of surprise, allowed him to subdue the operative without alerting his confederates. The terrorist was alive, but unconscious, and, more importantly, the device he had been carrying was now in the hands of counterterrorism specialists who could analyze its purpose and capabilities. The captured equipment revealed the true sophistication of the plot. The devices were not just surveillance tools, but components of a comprehensive electronic warfare system designed to disable palace security systems at precisely coordinated moments. The terrorists had planned to create windows of vulnerability that would allow their assault teams to penetrate defenses that had protected the monarchy for generations. As midnight approached, Morrison found himself at the center of an operation that would determine not just the safety of the royal family, but potentially the stability of the British government itself. The ceremonial duties that had defined his military career were now revealed as preparation for a moment when the ancient traditions of the Coldstream Guards would face their ultimate test against modern threats. The command center confirmed that additional terrorist operatives had been identified throughout the palace complex. Morrison and his fellow Coldstream Guards were no longer protecting a building, but fighting a shadow war in the corridors and hidden passages of one of the world's most significant royal residences. The next phase of the operation would determine whether centuries of military tradition could adapt quickly enough to defeat enemies who respected neither history nor honor. The rain hammered against the windows of Buckingham Palace as Lance Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his bearskin hat for the 100th time that morning. At 28, he had spent 6 years with the Coldstream Guards, standing motionless for hours in all weather, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. His boots, polished to mirror perfection, reflected the gray November sky as he took his position outside the palace gates. Morrison came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and James had always known he would follow in their footsteps. The Coldstream Guards represented the pinnacle of military precision and honor, and he wore the red tunic with immense pride. Every morning, he would look at himself in the mirror and see not just a soldier, but a guardian of centuries of tradition. The tourists gathered despite the weather, cameras clicking as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the stoic guards. Morrison had learned to tune out their chatter, their attempts to make him smile or move. Children would wave, adults would pose for photos, and occasionally someone would try to engage him in conversation. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. As the morning progressed, Morrison noticed unusual activity around the palace. More police than usual patrolled the perimeter, and senior officers moved with urgency that suggested something significant was happening. Through his peripheral vision, he could see palace staff hurrying back and forth, their faces showing concern rather than the usual calm efficiency. The first real sign that something was wrong came when his radio crackled to life. The voice was tense, professional, but Morrison could detect the underlying worry. Security protocols were being elevated across all royal residences. No specific threat had been identified, but intelligence suggested potential risks to members of the royal family during their scheduled public appearances that day. Morrison's training kicked in automatically. Years of discipline had prepared him for moments like this, when the ceremonial role of the Coldstream Guards revealed its deadly serious purpose. Behind the pageantry and tradition lay some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, ready to protect the monarchy with their lives if necessary. The crowd outside the gates seemed oblivious to the increased tension. Tourists continued to snap photos, children pressed against the railings, and street vendors sold souvenirs depicting the very guards who now stood on heightened alert. Morrison envied their innocence, their ability to see only the spectacle without understanding the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. As noon approached, the intelligence reports became more specific. A credible threat had been identified against Princess Catherine, who was scheduled to visit a children's hospital in East London that afternoon. The threat wasn't just against her personally, but potentially against innocent civilians who might be caught in any attack. The weight of this knowledge settled on Morrison's chest like a lead blanket. His commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, approached with measured steps. To any observer, this looked like a routine check, but Morrison could read the subtle signals that indicated urgent communication. Reynolds positioned himself where he could speak without being overheard by the growing crowd of onlookers. The captain's words were delivered in the calm, measured tone that characterized all Coldstream Guards communications, but their content made Morrison's blood run cold. Intelligence suggested that the threat might not be limited to the hospital visit. There were indications that the palace itself could be a target, using the hospital visit as a distraction to draw security resources away from the primary royal residence. Morrison felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with real danger, but his training kept his exterior perfectly composed. Years of standing motionless in all conditions had taught him to control his body's responses, to maintain the facade of ceremonial duty even when his mind was racing through tactical possibilities. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. Morrison's shift was supposed to end at 4 o'clock, but he knew that wouldn't happen today. When the royal family faced danger, the Coldstream Guards remained at their posts until the threat was neutralized, regardless of scheduled rotations. His thoughts turned to his wife Sarah and their 3-year-old daughter Emma, waiting for him at home in their small flat near Wellington Barracks. Sarah understood the demands of military life, having grown up as an army daughter herself, but she worried constantly about the risks her husband faced. She often joked that standing guard looked like the safest job in the military, not understanding that the Coldstream Guards were often the first line of defense against threats most people never knew existed. The radio chatter increased throughout the afternoon, reports flowing in from various security agencies. Morrison could piece together fragments of information, building a mental picture of a coordinated threat that was larger and more sophisticated than initially believed. This wasn't the work of a lone individual, but an organized group with detailed knowledge of royal protocols and security procedures. Captain Reynolds returned with another update. this time accompanied by a plainclothes officer from the Metropolitan Police Counterterrorism Unit. The hospital visit had been postponed, but intelligence suggested the threat had evolved. Rather than abandoning their plans, the hostile group appeared to be adapting, possibly accelerating their timeline. As evening approached, Morrison realized that this day would be unlike any other in his military career. The ceremonial duties that had defined his service were about to give way to the harsh realities of modern security threats. The red tunic and bearskin hat that symbolized centuries of British military tradition would soon be tested against enemies who respected neither history nor honor. The palace grounds took on an ominous quality as darkness fell. Floodlights illuminated the building's facade, but they also created deeper shadows where threats might hide. Morrison's enhanced night vision, honed through years of military training, scanned constantly for anything unusual. Every movement in his peripheral vision demanded assessment. Every sound required evaluation. His radio crackled again with an update that changed everything. Intelligence had identified the specific nature of the threat, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The hostile group wasn't planning a conventional attack, but something far more devastating that could affect not just the royal family, but hundreds of innocent people in the surrounding area. Morrison felt the weight of his weapon beneath his ceremonial uniform, a reminder that beneath the pageantry lay the lethal capabilities of one of Britain's most elite fighting units. The moment he had trained for his entire career was approaching, and everything he believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice would soon be put to the ultimate test. The tourist crowds had thinned as evening fell, but a few dedicated royal watchers remained, hoping to catch a glimpse of arriving dignitaries. They had no idea that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most significant security incidents in modern royal history, or that the motionless guard they photographed was about to play a crucial role in preventing a catastrophe that could have changed Britain forever. As the clock struck 8, Morrison received the signal he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The threat was imminent, and the ceremonial duties of the Coldstream Guards were about to transform into a life-or-death mission that would test every aspect of his training, courage, and commitment to the oath he had sworn to protect the crown.